Good morning. My name is Gustavo Alegrete. I'm a journalist. I work for the international news channel NTN24, and I would like to welcome everyone to the second day of the 24th Annual CAF Conference, organized by the Inter-American Dialogue, CAF Development Bank of Latin America, and the Organization of American States. We are coming to you live from the conference headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Before getting started, I want to remind everyone to explore the platform that has been built exclusively for this conference. If you registered for the event, you should have received your platform login and password via email. On the platform, you can find the agenda, read about our speakers, and engage via Twitter with other conference participants using our hashtag, DiálogoCAF2020. But most importantly, you can network and chat with your fellow attendees, as well as submit questions for all of our panels. We also want to thank our media partners, El País, América Economía, and the international news channel NTN24, and welcome everyone who has joined through their platforms. We are now going to jump right into our first session of the day, Successes and Failures, Hemispheric Health Systems Severely Tested. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Julio Frank, former Minister of Health of Mexico and President of the University of Miami. He was the founding Director General of the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico and has held top positions at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, including Executive Director in charge of Evidence and Information of Policy, among others. He is also the former Dean of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Frank. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I want to start by thanking Michael Shifter, President of the Inter-American Dialogue, and Luis Carranza, President of CAF, for the invitation to serve as our moderator for this panel discussion on the successes and failures of hemispheric health systems in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's session is available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. I will begin by introducing our distinguished panelists, whose insight and experience will shed light on how health systems are grappling with this truly unprecedented challenge posed by the pandemic. Each of the panelists will answer a question specific to their areas of expertise. We will then engage in a little bit of a group discussion, and then we will reserve the final portion of our time together for questions and comments from the audience. Before we begin, I want to share just a very few words about where we find ourselves. As I'm sure all of you are abundantly aware, Latin America has become a global hotspot for COVID-19, with more than 5 million confirmed cases. And with only 8% of the world's population, the region has 43% of the average daily deaths worldwide. In fact, the two largest Latin American economies, Brazil and Mexico, are among the 4 countries with the highest number of deaths in the world, the other two being the United States and India. Now, health systems in the region are facing, with this unprecedented challenge, are facing layers of accumulated deficiencies, including shortages of medicines and staff, including problems with access to health services. On top of that, due to severely reduced income, interruptions in public transportation, and just sheer fear of the pandemic, many people in the region are reluctant to seek care. And of course, at the same time, beyond the suffering caused by the pandemic itself, very long-standing disparities based on poverty, ethnicity, and sex and gender persist and have a significant impact on the outcomes of the pandemic. So some of those inequalities are being exacerbated, are both thriving and being exacerbated by the pandemic. Professional and unpaid caregivers are at a particular risk, with poor women suffering the most as they struggle to earn an income while caring for children, the elderly, and the sick. The complexity of challenges in the region makes one thing certain. Now is the time to shore up, not divest of, anti-poverty, and universal healthcare programs in the Americas. And to discuss this and other issues, we really have a stellar panel, a number of experts with an incredible collective wisdom and level of experience that it is truly my honor and privilege to introduce all of them. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Luciana Borio, Vice President at InQtel and former Director of Medical and Bio-Defense Preparedness at the U.S. National Security Council. A licensed physician, originally born in Brazil, Dr. Borio is an expert in biodefense issues, infectious diseases, and complex public health emergencies. Prior to her role at the National Security Council in the U.S., she served as acting chief scientist of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and Assistant Commissioner for Counterterrorism Policy at the FDA. We also have Dr. Carissa Etienne. Very nice to see you, Carissa. She is the director of the Pan American Health Organization, which is, in addition to being the health agency of the Inter-American System, is the regional office for the Americas of the World Health Organization. Dr. Etienne is now on her second term at PAHO, her second 5-year term. She previously served as Assistant Director General for Health Systems and Services at the World Health Organization. We also have Dr. Natalia Kanem, Executive Director for the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, and UN Under Secretary General. Dr. Kanem joined the UN as UNFPA representative in Tanzania, and then served as serving as Deputy Executive Director and now as Executive Director. Previously, she was the founding president of ELMA Philanthropies, Inc., Senior Associate of the Lloyd Best Institute of the West Indies, and she was Deputy Vice President of the Ford Foundation for Peace and Social Justice Programs. We also are honored to have Dr. Daisy Ventura, Professor in Global Health Ethics and Director of the PhD Global Health Program at Universidad de Sao Paulo. Her current research topics center on human rights during international health emergencies, including the protection of migrants and refugees, and the role played by the World Health Organization during international health crises, among other critical studies on global health. Unfortunately, we originally had Dr. Carla Visotti, Secretary of Access to Health in the Ministry of Health in Argentina. She was scheduled to round out our panel, but she's been called away to an important meeting actually related to the pandemic and will be unable to join us today. And most of it, than anything, I am truly honored by having a panel of only women. As someone who grew up with 5 sisters, this is simply a reminiscence for me of what's been most of my home conversations for most of my life. And I'm delighted to see this very distinguished group of experts participating in our meeting today. Let me move to our panel discussion. And I'd like to address the first question to Dr. Borio. Dr. Borio, as an expert in biodefense issues, infectious diseases, and complex public health emergencies, what do you see as the nexus between COVID-19 and national security?
Sure, and thank you. And thank you so much for having me today, Dr. Frank. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and these wonderful women. So, this issue of COVID-19 and national security, it's very clear to me that naturally occurring threats pose a national security threat as we define it. As a matter of fact, when I was still working at the National Security Council staff, we issued the National Biodefense Strategy for the United States. That was in September of 2018. And the strategy specifically talks about biological threats having an origin, whether they are naturally occurring, accidental, from the lab accident, or from a deliberate threat. They all pose a national security threat. So the strategy itself is agnostic to the origin of the threat. And it clearly talks about how the United States needs to prepare to manage risks, again, posed by natural outbreaks of disease, high consequence pathogens that leave a lab accidentally, or adversaries who wish to do harm to the United States with biological agents. I think to a lot of us in public health and medicine, it's been a frustrating path that despite these very top level strategy documents and articulation of priorities, that the programs themselves have been very slow to move, whether in the administration or in Congress. Over the years, spanning multiple administrations, there's been a bias towards funding deliberate biological threat programs. And I think it's pretty obvious today that it really is folly to think that we can have a robust biodefense enterprise directed at deliberate biological agents without really supporting the foundation of medicine and public health. And by the foundation, I mean active, good surveillance systems, diagnostic testing, access to care, public health measures. It doesn't do us much good to invest in another countermeasure against anthrax if we don't have the foundation of this house in order. And we need to find a way also to make sure that whatever capabilities exist, that they can be well integrated. Lastly, I'll say that if you think that the best deterrents to biological threats are exemplified about how we respond to them, I think that this latest episode in our history, very unfortunate, really leaves us more vulnerable because it really shows how we have been unable to mount a response that we have projected over the years we will be able to. So, and I think, and attribute that to the really a failure of integrating the capabilities that exist, and a failure to support the foundational structures that are required for any response of this magnitude.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borio. The next question is for Dr. Etienne. Being now in your second term as director of PAHO, can you talk a little bit about why regional cooperation is important in dealing with the pandemic, please?
Thank you, Julio, and good to see you. And let me thank the organizers for inviting PAHO to participate. As you well said, Julio, this is the most affected region in the world. And I think all of us are grappling with the realities of having to respond to this pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is really reaching every corner of the Americas and affecting lives and livelihoods of all people, but particularly the vulnerable population. And it is disproportionately impacting the health and well-being of the elderly, the poor, indigenous, Afro-descendant population, migrants, and people living with underlying conditions. COVID-19 has challenged our health systems, the likes that we have never seen before, resulting in deaths of more than 2,500 healthcare workers, based on information that we collected from 19 countries in the regions of the Americas. It has also devastated economies, with a forecast from ECLAC of a 9% reduction in GDP, with 45 million more people who will fall before the poverty and below the poverty line. So from the very outset, I have posited that the pandemic is generating a triple crisis in the region: a health crisis, a social crisis, and an economic crisis. And in the joint work that we did with ECLAC, it is clear that we will not be able to restart the economy if we do not address the health crisis. So this pandemic is global, it's regional, it is national, and it is local. And because of the nature of the pandemic, it is clear that no municipality, no state within a country, no country itself can go it alone. So action is required at all levels, at the community to the national level, from the regional to the global level, in combating the triple crisis. And so we believe that it's only through a concerted and collective action that we will address COVID-19, we will be able to suppress its transmission and recover the path for sustainable development. And so PAHO has from the outset highlighted the need to promote solidarity and collective action, and to build on what is a long history of solidarity in this region. This region, through solidarity, has been able to eliminate vaccine-preventable diseases, many of them, to address neglected and communicable diseases, and has built regional mechanisms like the 40-year-old revolving fund for vaccines and the 20-year-old strategic fund for medicines and strategic supplies. So what does solidarity or regional cooperation mean in the region? I think importantly, building consensus with all actors, with very strong leadership at the national level to control the spread, to protect our vulnerable population, and to reactivate our economies. It means promoting the joint work between countries to share information and resources and to track the evolution of the pandemic across the region. And so it is for this reason that I have convened monthly dialogues between ministers of health from the region, and we've met heads of state and called meetings with the various regional integration mechanisms like CARICOM and Mercosur, COMESCA and PROSURE, so they can begin to exchange their information, their experiences, and their interventions. But it also means working with countries of the region to jointly ensure access to a vaccine when this becomes available. We are astutely aware of the need to build regional partnerships across sectors, to seek synergies between all the regional stakeholders to tackle the pandemic. And so we've been working very closely with many of the indigenous institutions, with our friend Alicia Bassana at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, to produce very sound recommendations and guidance for our countries on controlling the spread of COVID-19 while promoting social protection for people and reactivating economies. For instance, I'm in regular contact with Luis Alberto Moreno, the president of the Inter-American Bank, as we coordinate our efforts to boost the fiscal capacity in countries to finance the national response plan and to support access to COVID-19 supplies and medicines, and hopefully eventually vaccines when that becomes available through the PAHO revolving fund. We are having similar work with the European Union, with the IOM on health of migrants, with UNICEF on vaccines, and we are working with the World Bank and the World Economic Forum on searching the national capacity, with private sector and civil society groups playing a critical role and exploring what is this role that we can play. So the support that we've received for the regional work has been unprecedented, and there are many partners who've involved, and I really want to thank them for supporting us. And so it is really the Pan-American organization. That's who we are. And at the very basis of who we are is solidarity, a word that is so very much used in the region of the Americas. We have a role of bringing all of the actors to the table in health, and within the context of this pandemic, it is more than ever necessary, this regional cooperation and collaboration. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Teresa. You're like many other global health leaders we have for decades been talking about the determining factor that health conditions have on the economy. And if we ever needed some proof of that statement, this pandemic has just shown how you cannot separate health concerns. So it's great to see how you're managing all those connections in an effective way across the hemisphere. So thank you very much for your work and for your sharing your experience here. Let me now turn to Dr. Cannon. Natalia, you have worked with various organizations focused on social justice. What are, in your view, the most pressing social justice issues that the pandemic has laid bare?
Thank you for leading the panel, but also for your great leadership over the years up until today. And I think it's a fantastic panel. I'm delighted to be back with my sister, Carissa Etienne. Gratitude to PAHO for everything that you're doing to save lives at this time. And this is a great question about the social justice issues. It comes down to understanding that the pandemic is only exposing and revealing the deep inequality, which was lying dormant, the iceberg that was there all along. And now, actually, the people who were already vulnerable are the hardest hit due to the pandemic. As always, it's been the poorest and the most vulnerable communities, those who were already most marginalized. It's been women and adolescent girls, Indigenous people, and people of African descent, and older persons. So when we think about domestic violence skyrocketing during this period of COVID, that's an epidemic within the pandemic. And what a shame for our region of Latin America that femicide, is one of the things that we lead on. This is a disgrace to women's rights. Now, with the movement restrictions and all the barriers going up, we find that women and girls are trapped at home, some of them in abusive situations, now compounded by the stress of everything that others already put on the table as the economy and the stress levels go up. We've been seeing at UNFPA that sexual and reproductive health services are attempting to be sidelined at a time when they really need to be lifted up. The health system, which is already struggling, now coping with the pandemic, is forgetting that women and girls are especially vulnerable. Children are at home. Girls can be vulnerable to exploitation just because their access, and there's a limit now, they're not going to school. So no one is there to tell what is going on. I believe that it's a little facile for us to think that everyone is connected to the internet. And a lot of what we're doing is predicated on being online. So ultimately, I think we see disadvantage being compounded by this lockdown environment. The social, the economic, and the health crisis is definitely there. And I would add to what Carissa put on the table to say, if we're thinking of building back better and greener, there's a gender dimension to that. Certainly there's an age dimension when older people have been isolated and unable to access some of the treatments, some of the groceries and the food that they need, very basic issues around gender and age. And now, coincident with COVID, we see the race dimension. If you're Indigenous or of African descent, it has been a nightmare to see how the pandemic has intersected with all of these other issues that are now so obvious. And I'm speaking of what we can see because we have data and have been able to document. So let's think about the fact that some of these issues are masked by the lack of data that we face. And as our region is now the epicenter for COVID, and seeing all of these deaths globally, and the suffering and the disproportionate ability to be able to deal with it, the heavy impact of COVID on Indígena communities and Afrodescendiente communities is rooted in these structural barriers where their health was already behind. And now we see systemic racism, and we need to look at that and call it that. We see discriminatory public policy and marginalization all coming to the fore. And I just would like to make the point that women worldwide, and Latin America no different, we are 70% of that health workforce. So scrambling to do the logistics and get the PPEs to the midwives that UNFPA, PAHO, all of us are working with, has been a bit of a challenge. I'm also extremely concerned about the humanitarian gap, Venezuela right now, and the migrants who are rushing to go back again because of discrimination. That is something that we need to deal with. And lastly, now I'll put on my UNFPA hat. If a woman does not wish to become pregnant during this pandemic, right? If a girl is menstruating during this pandemic, these are issues that are human dignity issues. Having control over your body, being protected from violence and harm, not being pregnant if you do not wish to become pregnant. All of this has led us to do a quick analysis. And we're showing that pregnancies in the region among teenagers, where, as you know, we lead the world, teenage pregnancy overall could increase by another 20% due to the COVID pandemic. I'm talking about 500,000 births over the course of a year. So absolutely, Julio, I think the question about the foundations of social justice and going back to the origins of our solidarity is going to be very important as we address the pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you. Those are really relevant and profound issues. And hopefully the pandemic serves us to focus them. As we see, even obviously in the United States, which is very much part of this hemisphere, we see those issues being accelerated as the disparities have been magnified by the public health crisis. Thank you very much for those comments. Let me turn now to Dr. Ventura and seek her perspective. Dr. Ventura, your question covers human rights during international health emergencies. So I want to ask you, what are the biggest ethical issues COVID-19 has raised for decision makers in government and the private sector?
Bom dia, é uma honra para mim participar desse.
Good morning. It's a true pleasure for me to take part in this event, working with extraordinary women and with a very renowned moderator. I thank CAF and I thank the other organizers for this event and also for allowing me to speak in Portuguese. I think that the first big challenge, ethical challenge that we need to tackle is at the end of the COVID-19 emergency, public health should not go back to being something that's sidelined, neglected our countries, most of by governments and the private sector in our countries, because COVID-19 has made public health a public policy and budgetary priority in our countries. Now, there has to be a balance within governments, and health authorities now have been moved up to the front lines of public policy. All of the information on health and health specialists now have been brought to the fore, and the role is highlighted, but that should not be forgotten once this crisis passes. Public health can't just be what's left between one emergency and another. Many governments and many companies have discovered the worst way possible in full swing of the crisis that health is determined by social factors, and that health itself is a decisive factor that determines the social and economic lives of a country. Likewise, I think that the second largest ethical challenge of the pandemic is social protection. Dr. Carissa, Dr. Cannon, and others have already underscored this. When the state adopts restrictive measures that restrict citizens' rights, these need to be accompanied by social protective measures, especially economic measures to protect the most vulnerable. You can't just invest in surveillance. You have to ensure that a basic income or minimum income policy be instituted that is done in such a way that health providers are respected by the populace, especially the most needy and the vulnerable, especially when non-essential economic activities are suspended by law. Now, it's disgraceful that in our countries, people have been forced to choose between going hungry or exposing themselves to the risk of contracting COVID-19. But this is not only an ethical matter, it has to do with being efficient and effective in your response, because there is no real response mechanism for this emergency that will be capable of overcoming huge economic and social deficiencies and gaps that exist in our countries. There are many ethical challenges, but I'm just going to focus on one more, which is democracy and protecting democracy. Authoritarianism and populism are serious threats to the health of the populations of our region. Public health matters cannot become an excuse for backsliding in individual rights, nor should this health crisis be used in the electoral conflict, because we're talking about the lives of millions of people that are jeopardized because of ideological polarization. Institutions and societies need to set limits and how they react. We have to severely punish the spread of fake news, no matter who generates this fake news. And health authorities need to be allowed to work in peace. We have to protect the press and human rights defenders and ensure that trustworthy information on health actually reaches the population. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Thank you very much. Those are, again, excellent points. And you touch also on something that Dr. Boria mentioned, this interlude where we lose the capabilities on, or in this case, the public attention to public health. I'm also glad that you mentioned this is really the fourth crisis in addition to the public health, the economic and the social. There is a political crisis. And I will, as many have noted, there is an association. I'm not saying it's a cause and effect relationship, but it does happen to be the case that the countries of the world, not just the region, that have had the worst performance in terms of dealing with the public health emergency, with the pandemic itself, happen to be populist governments. And the way in which some countries are using the emergency to advance that kind of agenda, whether it is to blame outside elements and reinforce a hyper-nationalistic isolationist discourse, or whether it is to justify a rise in authoritarian rule. These are all fundamental consequences, and I'm glad you brought them to the fore. There is also a political dimension here. So thank you to the four of you for this very insightful initial reflections. So I'd like in the second block to look a little bit more about what has been the experience so far, what have been the national and regional responses to the pandemic. So I'd like to start with, we have two panelists who are very much present at the national level, although obviously very connected globally, Dr. Boria and Dr. Ventura. And I'd like to ask them first about, in the case of Dr. Boria, the situation here in the US, and then I'll turn to Dr. Ventura about Brazil. And then, of course, we have two very distinguished members of the UN system and the the Inter-American system. And I'd like to then address some of the regional and global responses. But let's start with the well, actually the two largest economies in the hemisphere. And as I said before, along with Mexico, three of the top countries in terms of the number of deaths globally. So, Dr. Boria, how do you see the situation in the United States?
Sure. So, I think it's important to appreciate the things that seem to have worked. And sadly, I think that we have more things that didn't work, and I'll touch base on those. But I'd like to take a moment to just acknowledge that, one, we are living in a moment of tremendous polarization and division. And normally when faced with a crisis like this, the population will unite against a common threat. And this hasn't happened, which is really extraordinary and sad. But putting that aside for a moment, the parts of the society that responded well did so very well. We had tremendous cooperation of very large segments of the public with social distancing, with mask wearing. And I was very encouraged to see the private sector also jump very quickly to the extent that they could to facilitate the teleworking. We had technology, of course, to underpin that, but they didn't hesitate to encourage and the teleworking and the social distancing. Of course, does not apply to every occupation and segment of society. We saw, the flip side, that there were many that were not protected, and we see workers in congregate settings and living in very precarious socioeconomic conditions, an inability to afford the same types of benefits that large segments of the population were able to avail themselves of. But it worked. The other thing that is remarkable, and again, it's not perfect, and they still have a lot of way to go, and we don't know if it will succeed yet. But Operation Warp Speed, which is the program that the U.S. organized to be able to expedite development of vaccines, taking a very broad portfolio management, leveraging several technologies and organizing in a way that could truly move things very quickly through clinical development and manufacturing. And it's remarkable to see how the US government, when it wants to organize a certain way, can really move, mountains. And that is the vaccine development is proceeding at a very rapid pace and adhering to very strong scientific standards. That they're doing their randomized controlled clinical trials, 30,000 individuals for each vaccine. And I think it's important to celebrate that. Of course, it's not going to count for anything if we don't get the population trust, if we don't have a pharmacovigilance system in place, if we don't get the distribution, the physical distribution, done well, if we don't find a way to share regionally and globally, because we know that nobody's going to be safe until everybody's safe. So there's a lot more work to be done, but I just think it's remarkable that we were able to organize this way. And also, I have to say that it wouldn't be possible without the scientific investments in novel technology that has occurred over the last several years, including by smaller programs within the Department of Defense, the mRNA technologies for vaccine. All these, they don't materialize overnight. They require sustained investment. In terms of challenges that we have, look, we still have a system where we have difficulty integrating different components that are required for a 21st century society and threat. We still have local public health working in isolation with very little support from other technologies and sectors. So the integration of different communities and disciplines and knowledge has been a real challenge for a country like ours. The other thing is that we have an aging infrastructure for public health and clinical trials, for example. We're doing clinical trials that are, vital. We have electronic health records, we have very large healthcare systems, and we're basically repurposing clinical trial systems that were established decades ago to study HIV, to study influenza. In the UK, in contrast, they're actually leveraging the healthcare system and technology to be able to do simple, pragmatic clinical trials that can really rapidly give us the answers we need for which products might work or hurt. So again, we are repurposing things, but I don't think that we should be in this stage in the 21st century. And we have also failed to incorporate technology into public health the way we need to. A great example is contact tracing, where it's the bread and butter of public health. And it's been, there's no way to do that at the scale or speed that is required, even though we can use it as a talking point, but we can effectuate that with technology. And the analogy I like to use that is like Uber. Uber, everybody knows Uber, and Uber was able to become a giant, company because they're able to effectively integrate technology into something that has been in existence for many years, which is, a regular cab ride. And we have to do the same thing for our public health systems to be able to be more effective. And lastly, I think that there's a moral issue with that. It's a significant shortcoming, which is the fact that we have failed, and there's no other way to say that, I can't sugarcoat it, to really protect the most vulnerable of our population, whether it's the elderly, whether it's workers in meatpacking industries, and including in healthcare workers. It's really been sad to see pictures of healthcare workers using, trash bags as PPE. And how did this, how can we allow this to happen? And but we need to come to terms with that and address it. And as Natalia mentioned, this is not something that occurred because of the pandemic. It's been there for a while, but we just never really found a successful way to address something that is now abundantly evident in our day-to-day as we respond to this pandemic.
Thank you very much. How about Brazil, Dr. Ventura?
Como disse a doutora Luciana no início da sua fala,
As Dr. Luciano was saying at the beginning, we also have had much political polarization, and I believe that that is also the case of Argentina. It's a real pity that Dr. Carla Pisotti isn't here with us from Argentina, because whether in the US or Brazil, the success of Argentina's response was to overcome the political polarization, unlike what we did. And they built a political consensus in the response to the pandemic, and that goes a long way toward explaining Argentina's success. But I'm going to speak about Brazil. Brazil was considered a developing country, one of the developing countries with the best capacity to respond to the pandemic. And this was something that was actually recognized by health, safety and security rankings throughout the world. Despite that, Brazil's response has been one of the most disastrous in the world. According to official data, up until yesterday, we had more than 4 million confirmed cases and more than 128,000 deaths. What happened to us? This is a hard question to answer in a short time, but I'm going to focus on the highlights, what I think the most important aspects are. Our single healthcare system is our strongest system. This is a complex, articulated system that brings together cities, states, and the federal government. Ours is a federal government, and that ensures guaranteed access to healthcare services to the vast majority of the population. Now, it has existed for 3 decades now and covers the full territory of Brazil, which is a huge country. We have some of the highest level health services, and we have programs that are international references. How we responded to HIV/AIDS, for example, different immunization programs, which have been held up as success stories worldwide. Now, that was a structural advantage that we have, comparatively speaking, but there were ideological, political, and passing elements that undermined that advantage. But without a doubt, if it weren't for this U.S. Single healthcare system, our response would have been much worse than it already was. Now, regarding the biggest mistakes we've made, the first were those naysayers, scientific naysayers, and the insistence of the populace to expose themselves, even at the top levels of politicians that didn't protect themselves. 4 different health ministers were forced to step down from the health ministry. The second largest mistake, I think, in my view, was that the federal government promoted the systematic obstruction of a local response mechanism that could have been effective. It declared war against state governors. It didn't pass on necessary funds to local health services that were needed, and also vetoed laws that would have been decisive in providing a proper response, among many other things. Third, Brazil decided not to play a leading role in the international scene and became subservient to certain foreign leaders. That void of leadership undermines international cooperation and regional cooperation that could also have been decisive for Brazil to respond better. But I would be remiss if I didn't speak about the good response within the press, within our healthcare system, within the research institutes and the academic sector. We are continuing to fight.
Let's turn out now to the regional and global perspective. So I'd like to ask Dr. Etienne and Dr. Canem, with respect to this dimension, to the regional and global responses to the pandemic, what are some of the takeaways that multilateral organizations should consider for the next pandemic or for the next wave of the COVID-19? And what is the most important thing that governments and citizens should be doing right now? What is the most important thing they could be doing? Let me start with Dr. Etienne, and then we'll move to Dr. Canem.
Thank you for this question. And certainly, I believe that governments must continue to prioritize, and they need to lead. And I think this actually aligns very well with the last response. Governments must lead the response, and they must strengthen intersectoral action in health to address this pandemic. But they also need to begin thinking about pandemic preparedness in the future. So let me say a few things that I think governments should be doing. Governments need to strengthen their health surveillance and the capacity of health systems to respond and to work and communicate effectively with their citizens and all stakeholders on the implementation and relaxation of public health measures so that we can reduce the transmission and maintain health gains. This means working with social affairs and the economy, as we've said before, to develop social protection policies, and that was mentioned, that are not directly linked with employment status, and that will protect the health and well-being of people and their families during pandemics, but also during economic downturns. This means working with the science and technology to ensure the minimum industrial capacity that will respond to the needs, the medical needs of this region, whether it is for PPEs, diagnostics, medicines, and health equipment. This region should be at the forefront of production. This means working with the telecommunications sector to create and expand the necessary telecommunications infrastructure that is so necessary for the digital transformation that must happen in health. It means working with labor and education to produce healthcare workers that we need for the healthcare systems of the 21st century, for resilient, inclusive, and integrated health systems. Most of all, I think it means that working with the economy, governments must ensure that the necessary paradigm shifts are made to address inequality that is so much a characteristic of our region, to eradicate poverty, and to ensure social inclusion. Health must be adequately financed with public resources. Health is a right. To ensure universal access to health and universal health coverage, to ensure equity and pandemic preparedness in the future. It is clear, and it has been shown, that the pandemics are exacerbated by segmented, fragmented, and underfinanced health systems. All of these are so common in the Americas. So it is time for us to assign the necessary level of investments to health systems that will ensure the provision of comprehensive and integrated care based on a strong primary healthcare system with the necessary resolution capacity at the first level of care. I just want to posit that a health system that cannot respond to the needs of their population in normal times will never have the capacity to surge capacity in times of a pandemic. In the Americas, public expenditure in health remains low, an average of 3.7%, when what member states have and what PAHO is recommended is 6% of your GDP. So as a consequence, the out-of-pocket expenditure is really high, resulting in catastrophic expenditures in health for more than 95 million people in this region. So I believe that there are also some important takeaways for multilateral organization. First and foremost, we need a strong, respected, and well-financed World Health Organization that has the capacity and tools, the financing for pandemic preparedness and response, for overseeing the implementation of the international health regulations, and intensifying the support for the development of resilient health systems. As we have done in the Americas, I believe that cooperation between multilateral organizations is and will remain critical in health and development, in health security, and pandemic preparedness. The depth and breadth of capacity within the multilateral system can be synergized through closer collaboration. And I need to say we are beginning to see this solidarity among the UN systems as they collaborate for COVID-19 and its response. I think, though, that this will be particularly important in the post-COVID era, when countries will need to recover the lost gains from COVID-19 and to transform their health, social, and economic sectors in a manner that will ensure that they are better prepared for such a global event, while at the same time responding better to the needs of people to produce more resilient and equitable societies in the future. We must build back better. We cannot remain where we were prior COVID-19. Post-COVID-19 is an opportunity that we must begin to work on now, and we must embrace this opportunity.
Yes.
Over.
I couldn't agree more. I hope the extent of economic damage has made policymakers realize that with a minute, infinitesimal fraction of what's been lost in the financial markets or in national economies, we ought to be able to fund a permanent system of public global health preparedness at a level that would prevent future catastrophes like this one. So let's hope that those lessons, and we just don't just go to a new, but to a better normal after the pandemic. Natalia, you had the last intervention before we open it for Q&A.
Gracias, Julio. Let me just say that it was really important for CAF to bring us together this week. This is the 24th session, I'm told. And in 24 years, let's admit that we've seen cycles of success and failure. But I think what's really important is the learning opportunity and the ability to get in there and learn and do. So the question of how we address this is very, very germane. Building back better and greener is what the multilateral system is holding up as our vision, that you learn from this and you come out of the crisis hopefully stronger and better and greener. And that's the S in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm heartened working as UNFPA does with young people to see that they actually believe in a multilateral world, in the type of solidarity that the other panelists have spoken so eloquently to, and the morality and the ethics that's been put right front and center. So I would say that we expect governments, we expect civil society, we expect a multilateral system that is willing to rush to where the problem is greatest. Let me just tell you, recently we met a young woman on the Colombia border of Venezuela. She came to an adolescent clinic where UNFPA works to protect against teen pregnancy. And listening to her tell the story of being, having to flee her home, having walked to this clinic, et cetera, and now she really does not want to face pregnancy and everything that goes along with societal judgment and her vulnerability, because she has to survive in a world where she's not going to have a regular job in the next foreseeable future. So in speaking with her, you really see the kind of acute pressure that women and girls are facing. It's up to us all to knit together that social fabric that's going to protect her from harm, that's going to safeguard her. Just in Venezuela alone, a lot of the issues that the multilateral system can uniquely address. The health system, as Carissa has put on the table, but also migration. What are we going to do in a humanitarian context that's exploding? And I think the sort of facile understanding that, okay, you're from a big economy, you're Brazil, you're, a well-off Caribbean country. Now that Sustainable Development Goal number 10 on inequality is staring us in the face. So the middle income country can't afford to shrug off COVID any more than, the poorest among us, Haiti, et cetera. So I believe that this character of success and failure that our panelists couching today is also well suited for us, because we come from a region where innovation is part of our character. So we've got to call on some of that creativity in order to address some of these issues. And first of all, we can't close the gaps if we can't see them. This was supposed to be a big census year, 2020. As the head of the United Nations Population Fund, we've had to hold hands with governments to say, we don't give up on counting people. That's how we know who is where and what the needs are. So even with the delays, we're pressing ahead on the issue of census because good data is what makes vulnerable people visible. And we have to know where they are to count them. UNFPA has provided an online dashboard. It's a website where you can go and see with COVID-19 mapping who is vulnerable by age, by disability, et cetera. And we're trying to break this down even to the district level to help that district governor or commissioner to be able to see where the people are that are in need. Second, in order to help somebody like Lourdes, this girl I was talking about on the border in the clinic in Venezuela, we have to ask her. We have to consult with her community. We need to know what her mother thinks and her grandmother, et cetera. So what are the mechanisms to engage women's organizations and youth networks? And I think we really have to get serious about the co-creation of these solutions. You know, as an epidemiologist myself, and Julio, I mean, you've been at this for quite a while. We kind of think we know what the prescription is. It seems very obvious, but if it doesn't take root in local communities, if Lourdes doesn't believe that she has human rights that she can claim, then again, you know, I really don't want to be spinning wheels 24 years hence when CAF convenes the next generation. And good luck to those young people, because they're ready to engage. We've seen them on the streets demanding social justice and a solidarity now across race and class and all of these other things. So I think, you know, it really goes double in a time of humanitarian crisis. And the last thing I would like to say is that the centrality of the health system means that it's an all hands on deck moment. And I think, you know, we've already heard about how the vaccine programming and the imagination that it's going to take, not just the scientists at the bench, but those of us who have to figure out how are we going to bring it into the neighborhoods, how are we going to deal with the politicization of health. You know, the suspicion and fear around vaccines is going to be terrible for vulnerable people in our communities. So ultimately, I think countries have signed on to these agreements. We need to hold them accountable. This roadmap that we envision to build back better and greener has to have that justice and inclusivity and more equity as the aspiration. For me, I would say that we're not giving up. We're in there. We're in there with a lot of you fighting the idea that you shrug it off and it's business as usual. No, I think women's lives are important. You know, I care about this adolescent girl. I think we all know that we should not negotiate away people's rights and well-being. And so I think the time is now to imagine that future that's going to make this region stronger and that's going to deliver on the promises that we heard in Cairo, we heard in Beijing. And I think, you know, it's been a shining moment for WHO to show that, you know, we really should look together at how we coordinate, how we deliver, and how we plan. Thanks, Julio.
Thank you. I think it certainly poses an agenda for the next 75 years of the UN, of the United Nations system. We have just a few moments before the end of our session, but I'd like to turn now to the Q&A portion and see if there are questions from the audience.
So, Julio, thank you everyone for that fascinating discussion. It is clear that the Latin American and the Caribbean region is facing a challenge, and it is clear from the panelists how important is having strong public health systems in order to deal with these health challenges. I will now turn to the audience, as you said, for their questions. I think we have only time for one, maybe two. But before that, please remember that you can submit questions directly to our platform by going to the Q&A page. Once there, you can also vote for the most interesting questions. Please include your name when you submitted a question. The first question, Julio, comes from Enrique Cornejo from Peru. He said, we are facing a perfect storm, a health crisis, economic crisis, social unrest, and in many countries of the region, elections in the coming weeks or months. How do we have to deal with all these challenges at the same time? How do we choose what is urgent and critical and what is not, with fiscal responsibility, and at the same time looking at the future. Enrique Cornejo de Perú dice: enfrentamos una tormenta perfecta, crisis sanitaria, económica, malestar social y en muchos países elecciones a la vista. ¿Cómo afrontar estos desafíos simultáneamente? ¿Cómo afrontar lo urgente con responsabilidad social y mirando el futuro? Julio.
Thank you, gracias. Let me turn it over to ask which of the panelists would like. It's a complex question and we're against the time, so we'll have to be brief, but would anyone want to address? Natalia, please.
Yeah. Well, I'll just make one point. I think for me, Enrique is asking the right question at the right time. And what we need to see is building some serious alliances and partnerships who are willing to fight collectively. Private sector, civil society, hand in hand with government. And I think the mobilization of society is already happening. So now using the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed on as a roadmap, there are 17 of them. The world has said that this is the way forward. So we use that and tailor and adapt it at this moment. And the first 5 deal with the basic issues of health, education, hunger, right? And gender, which for me, I think is also one of the non-negotiables. So let me just leave it there for brevity. Thanks, Julio.
Thank you. Carissa?
Julio, this is really a complex question. And what we are seeing is countries grappling with how do they restart their economy and how do they also address the other priorities in terms of social and health. And what was very clear, as I said in the ECLAC-PAHO document, is that you cannot restart your economy if you do not focus on stopping the pandemic and reducing the impact of that pandemic. You cannot restart your economy if you don't take care of your people in the informal economy, that you don't take care of poor and disadvantaged persons. And so these are complex questions for governments. And I believe and I want to agree with Natalia, it's the alliances that count. How do you deal with a multi-sectoral approach? How do you bridge between political parties, between political ideologies, and put the people first? And I think this is a time that we are being called to put people first in terms of development. And how do we make them an integral part of that development and the shaping of the future? And this is a challenge, not just for governments, but for all of us in this region. Over.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the issues that's hurt the response has been the idea that there's a zero sum or a trade-off between reactivating the economy or protecting people's life. And I think what you're hearing from these comments is those need to be tackled together. And there are some very specific measures that actually will help both. Wearing face masks, that will help protect health and reactivate the economy. Increasing radically the number of tests, that will help both. Eventually getting a vaccine will help both. There's a number of issues where we need to think that these are synergistic and not conflicting objectives. Do we have time for another question, or we're at the end of our time?
I have a challenge. If you accept the challenge, we have 2 minutes, Dr. Frank. But I have one that if the panelists are very short, and it could be, according to the question, we are on time. So Camila Perez from Colombia, she said, the pandemic has brought on stress to all aspects in society. In the health systems in the region, what has been the weakest point of the systems and the strongest? The weakest point and the stronger. La pandemia ha creado gran estrés en los sistemas de salud, dice Camila de Colombia, y pregunta, ¿cuál es?
We are saying the pandemic has created great stress on the health systems. What is the weakest and the strongest point that these health systems have faced?
And Daisy actually tried to get those 2 points, but if you can in 30 seconds restate a little bit of the plus and minuses that you already and will wrap with your final comments. Luciana?
Sure. So the weakest point has been the disparate access by different populations to quality healthcare. But the strongest has been the people, the healthcare workers themselves, who in every, and I don't know of any country where they didn't, take this mission very seriously and went above and beyond to make sure they performed what they do on a daily basis under tremendous duress.
Absolutely.
Daisy, one last comment.
Eu só acrescentaria que nós não.
I would only add that we can't imagine that a health system by itself is capable of resolving something that involves the entire economy, the population. So until we have focused, efficient communication, health as a priority, we will continue to see an excessive burden on the health system to resolve challenges such as a pandemic. So I agree with what was said prior to me, but I would like to stress health systems cannot be solely responsible for resolving this. Society and government must be engaged as well.
I just want to say what an outstanding panel of really outstanding leaders. It's you feel that this is a huge challenge, but there are so many bright persons, including our 4 panelists today, who are really providing amazing leadership and insights that we hope governments around the world and civil society around the world will heed. So I want to thank again the Inter-American Dialogue and CAF for having brought us together in this very, very significant and consequential conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Frank, for such an amazing moderation. Very interesting and helpful. For our viewers, we'll be back shortly for the second panel of the day.